Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar. It is the final webinar in our energy resilience series this spring. Let's give Zoom a chance to let everyone into the room. While we're waiting for everyone to file in, please take a moment and locate the chat. Let us know who you are and where you're from. Always nice to see a familiar name, and feel free to say hi to one another. Hopefully everyone's who's experiencing the heat wave out east is managing to stay cool. We got hit here in Denver over the weekend. Luckily, things have cooled down a bit since then. For us, we put out our inflatable pool and filled it with some nice cold water. Felt like an alpine lake. Let the sons, my sons have, and their friends have an opportunity to cool down. If anyone has any other coping strategies, maybe some that relieve the electric grid of all that stress from cranking AC units. I'm sure people would love to hear about that in the chat. Otherwise, I think, we've got enough time has passed now, and we can get going with the webinar at hand. So good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's National Conference of State Legislatures webinar, Identifying and Mitigating Risks, Utility and State Planning Practices. My name is Dan Shea. I'm a program principal in NCSL's energy program, and I will be your moderator today. Today's webinar is part of a three-part webinar series on energy resilience. This is the third and final webinar in the series. The first tackled microgrids, the second looked at hardening electric infrastructure. Both of those webinar recordings are available to view on NCSL's website. You can reach out directly to me at the email you see on your screen if you'd like access to those. Today, we're going to consider state and utility planning practices aimed at mitigating risks to energy systems. We're going to hear from some great panelists representing a utility, a state agency, and a state legislature on the work they're doing in this area. I do want to note that all three of those webinars in the series are being developed with the support of the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Energy Security, Cybersecurity, and Emergency Response. We thank them for that support. Next slide, please. I also want to note that we recently published an issue brief on microgrids relevant to the first webinar in this series. This is about a 10-page primer that offers background on microgrids, what they are, who's interested in them, and what roles they can play in enhancing energy system resilience and reliability. It offers an overview of state legislative action on the topic. So for anyone who's interested in learning more, I would recommend checking out this new resource, and I believe a link has been added to the chat. Next slide. I also want to call attention to a broader webinar series taking place at NCSL, or just concluded. Our Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee hosts an annual webinar series. The final webinar in that series took place last Thursday. It considered wildlife corridors to facilitate wildlife migratory patterns. All of these webinars were also recorded, and you can view them at your leisure by visiting our website at ncsl.org. Now, next slide, please. We're almost ready to begin presentation, but first I want to review some of the housekeeping items. Today's webinar is a platform for information exchange and engagement. Throughout the webinar, we encourage participation through our chat. So feel free to type in your questions or answer any questions that you see using the chat box on your screen. We will be referencing the chat to pull questions for today's presenters. So please do submit those questions as they arise. No need to wait for the Q&A. We will keep track of them and ensure that that helps ensure that we roll seamlessly into our Q&A section. Finally, today's webinar is being recorded, and registrants will be able to access a recording of the webinar and presentation slides on NCSL's website after the webinar completes. We will send out a notice once that resource is made available. All right, on to today's discussion. We're looking at how utilities and states are working to identify and mitigate risks from the most common threats in a region, whether that's wildfires, hurricanes, polar vortexes, or heat waves. Every corner of the country has its own issues to manage. And today we're going to hear from three different areas and the work that's being done by utilities and state agencies to mitigate those risks. We're also going to hear from a state legislator about how New York has worked to enhance resilience through legislation. Today, we're joined by Matthew Gardner, the Director of System Protection at Dominion Energy, Amanda LeMaster, the Energy Assurance Coordinator in the Kentucky Office of Energy Policy, and New York Assembly Member Amy Paulin. I want to extend a warm welcome and thanks to all of you for participating today. We are going to start with Matt. As mentioned, he is the Director of System Protection within Dominion Energy's Power Delivery Group. In this role, Matt oversees the company's system protection and organization, including both engineering and field operations. Since joining Dominion in 2008, Matt has held various roles in planning, operations, and engineering. Matt, we're thrilled to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
All right. Can you see and hear me okay?
Yes, we've got you.
All right. Very good. Thanks, Dan. And good afternoon or good morning. I want to really thank Dan and NCSL for involving me in today's conversation. And I was asked to provide about 10 to 15 minutes of remarks on how at Dominion Energy, specifically Dominion Energy Virginia, we identify and mitigate risks within the company and to our business. And so it's going to be a bit of a quick run through a lot of topics here, but I'm very much excited to be with you, and we'll look forward to addressing your questions towards the end of the session here together. If you don't mind, Aaron, let's go to the next slide. So Dominion Energy, in terms of developing a resilience strategy, which is certainly a component of mitigating risks to our operations, we tend to have this ever-ready posture of constantly assessing the threat space, working up mitigations, that is preventions for those threats, and then also making sure that when threats do arise that we can detect them and recover from them. And if you really think about the difference between reliability and resilience, a lot of that difference can lie within how you recover from an event. Reliability focusing on how you keep the lights on as a utility, but resilience really being a function of how you recover when something does threaten reliability. Now, this strategy, as I mentioned, it's a constant cycle of vigilance and preparation, detection and recovery. But this strategy has had to evolve over the past few years to really adapt to escalating and changing threats involving cybersecurity, physical threats, extreme weather, and even the unknown. So let's unpack that just a little bit. Next slide, if you would, please, Aaron. As you can see from this slide, it's been a busy decade or so, and many of the events on this timeline are probably still with many of you in terms of your recent memory. I know many of us still remember Superstorm Sandy and how that really awakened us to the threats of severe weather in a new and fresh way. And then, of course, the Ukraine cyber attacks, not to mention, the most recent conflict in Ukraine, but the cyber attacks that Ukraine had to deal with a number of years ago. And then, of course, Hurricane Maria, and here more recently, the Texas power crisis and the Colonial Pipeline attack. So it is quite an evolving and changing threat landscape. And as threats are realized, our industry has to adapt. And that industry, of course, includes the policy space, but also the operations and the utility space as well. If you don't mind, next slide, please, Aaron. And so, as I mentioned, Superstorm Sandy, that really focused us on severe weather. You might remember the Metcalf attack, which really brought a point to the discussion on physical attacks, physical substation security. And there was some industry action and some policy action that followed that, specifically NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation's Critical Infrastructure Protection Standard number 14, focused on analyzing threats to the grid and mitigating them. Some of you may or may not remember, but we had a solar maximum back in 2015. Another one is due here in a few years. And as the solar goes through this 11-year maximum and minimum, there are focuses and threats on the threats that are incident upon the grid from geomagnetic disturbances. We call that GMD. And then, of course, the Colonial Pipeline cyber attack really brought to a point the discussion of cybersecurity within the space of bulk infrastructure. And there's also this concern or this contemplation of what we call in the industry black swans, or some people call them black sky events. And those are high impact, low probability or low frequency events. Those are being contemplated as well. So this thread of threat and policy development is one of learning, design, and adaptation in both a technical sense, but also in a policy sense. Next slide, please. I don't want to make this any more of an eye chart than it is, but this does show the adaptability of the industry. Whereas threats are discovered, highlighted in red, you can see the industry and policymakers respond by adjusting how our industry is focused on these threats and the actions that we take to mitigate them. I don't want to make this any more of an eye chart, but I didn't even include in here some of the actions taken by the NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, along with the standards that focus on reliability there. So this is just a brief outline of some of the things we've seen in the news, how policies have adapted, and then of course in step with that, how our industry has adapted as well. Next slide, please. So the 21st century is a new space. This list, every time I come back to it, every time I give a talk like this, it seems like we find something else to add to the list. The most recent things I added to this list were the commodity risks and the supply chain risks, but certainly cybersecurity, physical threats, sabotage, and state actors. And I'm sure we can all understand some of the concerns associated with that. And even intellectual property theft and electromagnetic pulse are things that our industry has to contemplate, we have to take seriously, but we also then have to mitigate in a way that's responsible, both in terms of maintaining resilience and reliability, but also in being responsible for the proper level of investment and matching the dedication we have to serving our customers as well. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the world is changing, and these changes really mandate that we prepare, that we leverage technology, that we model how our system is going to behave, and that we also leverage the power of analytics. So that's what we have to do. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the mitigating measures we have in place here in future slides, but I also want to mention that the landscape in terms of the threats to reliability and resilience is changing at the same time as we're kind of rewiring the grid for renewable energy. And so as you think about renewable energy, that energy, generally speaking, is non-dispatchable, and it's something that the grid is having to adapt to as we also contemplate mitigating and preparing for some of these threats. So it's a layered challenge space, but it's also a space that is changing on multiple fronts as well. Next slide, please. So let me go into just a few of the examples of existing resilience measures in use today within Dominion Energy Virginia, and just hit them here briefly. Mobile substations. If you think about the substations, I think we can all envision a substation near where we live or near where we work. Think about those substations as threats. As we deal with threats with those substations, we have to think about what is our plan if that station is compromised, or if that station, if severe weather takes out that station, damages it, or if God forbid there's sabotage or some sort of physical threat on that substation. So at Dominion Energy, we think one of our strategies of dealing with threats to physical security threats and the threats of natural disasters on our system is having a mobile fleet of infrastructure, both at our high voltage transmission levels and distribution levels that we can mobilize to address threats to our system. We're always modeling climate and the impact of flooding on our system. And as we execute capital projects on our system with substations in low-lying areas, we are working to make sure that we have flood-ready infrastructure. That is, elevating certain control enclosures and certain equipment so that those areas are resilient to floods as they might occur on our system. Being strategic about storing spare equipment on our system. This is something that utilities need to contemplate as a resilience measure, being able to leverage spares when needed, and of course storing those spares strategically around your system. One thing I think we all learned, or we all got a fresh appreciation for with the Texas power crisis of last year, was the impact of cold weather on our system. And under the gas insulated infrastructure picture you see on this on this slide, just imagine a substation. As I mentioned, perhaps you live near one or you drive by one on the way to work. Just imagine taking that substation and putting it within pipes and putting those pipes within a building about the size of 1 or 2 high school gymnasiums. That's gas insulated infrastructure, and that gives us a great deal of resiliency to cold weather and the attendant snow and ice that can challenge reliability in those areas. Physical security, unfortunately in the 21st century, a chain link fence isn't all it takes to keep certain electric transmission infrastructure secure. We have to start thinking in terms of, higher fences that are anti-climb, anti-cut, anti-ballistic. And so we have targeted certain safe stations within our service territory to upgrade the physical security measures at those stations. And it's not just about walls and fences. It's also about technology as well, and leveraging gunshot detection and leveraging cameras and other analytics to help us keep an eye on what's happening at these substations. Remember, this type of infrastructure is generally it's not manned infrastructure. Most of this infrastructure operates without personnel on site. It would be easy for someone to say, well, why don't we just build all infrastructure in a Cold War era bunker, and that'll fix it. That'll keep us resilient to everything. Well, that might be the case, but then we couldn't afford to turn on the lights. And so we need to be strategic about how we invest in our system. However, it does make sense to take that extra measure of caution for certain elements within your system. And so in the bottom right-hand side here, I show a picture of our control center, our transmission bulk electric power system control center. That's as it was being constructed. We made the investment of putting that control center within an EMP protected and hardened building so that it's hardened against high winds, tornadoes, and even that electromagnetic pulse threat, that EMP threat on the building. So it doesn't make sense for every element of infrastructure, but for certain strategic components, those types of extra measures make a lot of sense. Next slide, please, Aaron. As we're transitioning the slide, I just want to take a quick moment to mention the importance that we found that operating our utility within a regulated environment that allows for us to make some of these investments, how important that is for us and for our customers. The least cost solution is not always the most resilient solution. Sometimes the least cost solution makes sense, but you have to look at your infrastructure development and then layer into that what makes sense in terms of the hazards, in terms of threats and the risks, and then start baking in those resiliency measures, which in some cases will involve additional investments. It costs more to put infrastructure within a building. You don't need to put all infrastructure within a building, but it costs more. It costs more to EMP protect a control center. You don't need to EMP protect every little piece of equipment on the system, but there are some costs associated with that. And so being within a regulatory environment that recognizes that and allows for prudent investments in resiliency, we've certainly found is in the favor of our customers, both from a resiliency and a cost effectiveness perspective. Grid transformation, a good example of some regulation within the Commonwealth of Virginia that's also helping us make our system resilient. I'll just call out a few of these, just keeping an eye on the clock. But main feeder hardening, that is targeting those circuits that have lower than average reliability and hardening essentially the trunk line of the distribution system. That's a significant resilience component of our grid transformation program. But also strategic undergrounding. And strategic undergrounding here, by that I mean focusing on those tap lines within neighborhoods. Typically the overhead distribution infrastructure you see in neighborhoods. We have a program that assesses the reliability of those tap lines and then targets the most outage prone tap lines to be put underground. And you might say, well, Matt, that helps those customers who get their lines undergrounded. But what I want to say is that actually helps the reliability and the resilience of our entire system. Because if you take off let's just take, for instance, a storm event. If you take that restoration of those smaller tap lines, if you take those off your plate, if you isolate those because you've undergrounded it, then your crews can focus in other areas and get the lights back on and be more resilient. So strategic underground, while the actual infrastructure that touches particular homes and neighborhoods is affected, strategic underground also benefits all of our customers. And as I mentioned here, I won't go through all of these, but you can see intelligent grid devices and technology deployment. technology plays a big role in this as well. Next slide, please. Finally, I just want to mention briefly, as I close down my talk here, the importance not only of leveraging technology and certain hardening investments on our system, but also being ready to bring the system back, to restore the system. Black start restoration is something that we focus on. We have multiple plans in place to bring our system back. We drill those plans. We coordinate with mutual assistance organizations. There's also state VDEM, the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. We partner in terms of drilling out these types of exercises. And this is certainly a part as well of what we consider to be prudent resiliency measures. So that's something that we focus on as well. Next slide, please. All of this, I say all of this based upon the premise that we must understand the power grid is the world's largest machine. So it's not all about iron in the ground and tech out in the field. It's also about understanding our system and making sure that we know how to model our system, and that we can, without actually impacting our system, that we can challenge our system with various simulations. So we've invested in real-time digital simulation infrastructure so that we can game out the various restoration strategies that we might need to leverage for our system. Next slide, please. It's not just about simulating the system, but it's also about modeling some of these types of threats to our system as well. As you can see here, I won't go through all of these for the sake of time. Top right, as an example of an electromagnetic pulse, and how that electromagnetic pulse can be attenuated by some of the fences that we place around our substations and the effects and improvements associated with that. So modeling analysis is important. Again, we're starting to touch on skill sets as well that are important for our industry also. Next slide, please, Aaron. As I mentioned as well, new technologies for a changing grid. Sometimes it makes sense. This is another look at the gas insulated switchgear. Sometimes it makes sense to harden your system for cold weather, for severe weather, for hot weather. Sometimes the mitigations for both extremes are the same. And again, there's a premium for hardening select infrastructure, but within a regulated environment that allows us to identify some of these strategic investments, we've certainly seen an advantage and a benefit to our customers. And then also making sure, as you see on the right-hand slide here, right hand of this slide, that we invest in technology as well. Next slide. Finally, we operate all of this within a state-of-the-art system operations center. I mentioned earlier, bottom left-hand side, this operations center exists within an EMP, electromagnetic pulse environment. Not everything needs to be within that environment, but certainly makes sense when you have high impact infrastructure to place it within an EMP protected environment. And that's what we have done at Dominion Energy. So that's how we prepare and mitigate and make our system more resilient. I appreciate, next slide, please. I appreciate everyone's time and attention on this. If you'd like to reach out to me, send me an email, matthew.gardner@dominionenergy.com, or call me on my cell phone. I'd be happy to talk with you more about this. Thanks for your time, everyone.
Thank you, Matt. That offered a really great overview. Also a great reminder about how the threat landscape has changed over the past decade and some of the events that spurred these important discussions. I especially appreciate you mentioning the cost considerations, always an important element to keep in mind. And Dominion, obviously, as you outlined, has some really interesting initiatives going on this front, and I appreciate you taking the time to describe how the utility is tackling these issues. Next up, we have Amanda LeMaster. We will hear from Amanda about how the state agency in Kentucky is working to address these issues. Amanda is the Energy Assurance Coordinator at the Kentucky Office of Energy Policy. The office was established by the Kentucky Legislature in 2018 and resides within the Kentucky Energy and Environment Cabinet. Amanda is responsible for enhancing the energy resilience and security of the Commonwealth by identifying opportunities to increase the ability to effectively respond to energy disruptions and to recover quickly. Previously, Amanda worked with the Kentucky Emergency Management. Amanda, take it away.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. I'm so pleased to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. That was a wonderful presentation, Matt. Very informative. It's always insightful to hear from utilities on ways you're working on energy resilience and mitigation planning. So thank you. I will definitely be following up with you after. So in Kentucky, the Energy Assurance Plan serves as the SOP for all energy disruptions in the Commonwealth. It provides a resource primarily for state energy emergency personnel that includes a description of our energy system. It provides the use and production, a profile of that. It has our monitoring and recovering procedures, as well as all of our contact information for key stakeholders in the energy sector. So also within our plan, we reference ESF 12, Emergency Support Function 12, that's energy. The Kentucky State Energy Office is the lead coordinating agency for ESF 12, and we're responsible for reporting accurate information on current energy profile, anticipated restoration times, as well as routing any resource requests either from our public-private utilities or from other community lifeline sectors. So we rely heavily on our public and private utility partners for information, as we have no regulatory authority on any of the way the energy system works or the restoration times. We are there primarily for situational awareness only, and that would probably be the case along most state energy offices across the nation. So luckily, having an emergency preparedness and response background, I'm fully aware that all events start local and that efficient and effective response requires adequate planning. So what we were able to do is we started looking at local emergency plans, and we quickly identified a gap in data addressing energy requirements and vulnerabilities at our critical facilities. We also noticed lack of reference to distributed energy resources as potential mitigation solutions. There were things listed in plans. They were your basic generators and grounding and things like that that are great mitigation solutions, but didn't think of new innovative ones. So we quickly noticed that. And really what this means for us is ESF 12, when we sit at the Emergency Operations Center, there's really no one resource, one-stop shop to get information on which critical facilities do or do not have energy capabilities. And what this does is it causes serious delays in our operational awareness during the time of a disruption. So in Kentucky, and with my emergency management background, we decided to do a bottom-up approach, and we wanted to incentivize our local communities to prepare for energy disruptions with education and outreach. What we wanted to do was increase the capability of and build the capacity of local governments to develop energy security plans at county levels, regionally, critical facility levels, all the above, and to propose and to complete mitigation project applications that either wholly or partially address power and general needs of energy infrastructure, critical infrastructure needs. So what this did was it prompted the Kentucky State Energy Office to apply for a 2020 Sprit Grant through FEMA, Building Resilient Communities grants. And we took the opportunity to collaborate with Kentucky Emergency Management, along with the Hazard Mitigation Program there within, and our 15 area development districts across the Commonwealth, which are responsible for our local hazard mitigation planning. What we wanted to do, we just wanted to start the discussion regarding energy infrastructure, critical infrastructure, energy capabilities, both electric and fuel, and brainstorm mitigation strategies to strengthen community resilience to energy emergencies. Everybody was on board. It really started with, do you have lists of your critical facilities, and have you thought of those in regards to your energy assets? And there were just a bunch of crickets. It wasn't really that surprising because we didn't find it in a lot of these plans, of course, which has prompted us to do this Sprit Grant. So technically, we would like to contract with each of our area development districts and have them survey critical facilities over 120 of our counties, and focus mainly on our FEMA community lifelines, and more so depending on the funding available, and generate a final report to identify vulnerable areas of the Commonwealth to prolonged energy disruptions. And this will include a list of current energy mitigation actions that will enhance each area development district's mitigation strategy section of the local hazard mitigation plans. I'm also happy to report that this the end result of these reports will also serve as a contribution to the 2025 Kentucky Enhanced State Hazard Mitigation Plan as well. They were the other CNCB applicant that received funding, and they're updating the state plan. So it's really perfect timing, the alignment of energy sector being more robust within our local emergency plan. So one thing I really wanted to note, as Matt was talking about costs and stuff, and even though it might be the best cost, doesn't mean it's most resilient. That's a very, very important point to come across, because one, it might be more cost effective. It might not be something your community promotes. It might not be best for that area if they're either vulnerable or have less resources to contribute to that cost. But one thing this grant will do as a feedback loop, it is expected, it's going to identify assets and system means, identifying populations affected by those assets and systems. So basically the energy assets and the systems within which they reside, and the populations affected, and to the extent to which these populations are affected, will all have an economic value that is able to be used as a benefit cost analysis and to help prioritize mitigation project needs. So what we did was we started planting seeds, and right now this awarded grant allows us to start seeing the sprouts. We're really just getting basic energy data that is missing within our plans, that will help prepare us for future resilience to our energy grid. And we're looking forward to getting that started. Right now, we're in the contracting process. We hope to have final reports from all 15 area development districts by the end of 2024. We look forward to seeing how the state rolls that up into their hazard mitigation plan, and how much more opportunity by having a more robust energy section within our mitigation strategy section plans, what type of funding availability opportunities will come from that. So that's what's going on, a part of what's going on in our state with energy assurance planning, something we're very proud of, and happy to help anybody else if they're interested in FEMA application or just FEMA hazard mitigation questions. I'm happy to help as it gets the conversation started.
Thank you, Amanda. I really appreciate that. It's great to see and hear about the work that you're doing in Kentucky. Some really great and interesting initiatives, leveraging partnerships and sort of enhancing coordination. And I'm really glad you mentioned the FEMA BRIC program. As mentioned, that stands for Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. As you highlighted, those grants can be really important funding sources for this type of work. For everyone's awareness, NCSL will be publishing a new resource on the role of BRIC to state mitigation work in the coming weeks, so do keep an eye out for that. I also want to take a quick moment to remind our participants, don't hold on to any questions that you have. If you've got something, please put it in the chat now, and that helps line up the Q&A to move smoothly moving forward. Finally, we're going to hear from New York Assemblymember Amy Paulin. Assemblymember Paulin has served the 88th New York State Assembly District since 2001. She chairs the Assembly Committee on Corporations, Authorities, and Commissions, and serves on the committees on Rules, Education, and Health. She has been very productive and successful during her time in the legislature, with over 300 of her bills having been signed into law. And I think we're going to hear about some of those bills today, as New York has taken a number of steps to increase the resilience of its electric grid following a number of significant storm events. Assemblymember Paulin, thank you for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm reminded by hearing the other two speakers how different we all are across the country, and how valuable a session like this can be, so that we can learn and change things as a result. So New York has suffered in the last decade with what feels like, and I think is, very increased severe storms and damage. And we have a very old infrastructure. So starting with Sandy, Quinn, Riley, And in August of 2020, Tropical Storm Isaias, they all tore through New York, leaving behind downed trees, power lines, and resulting in hundreds of thousands of customers without power. Approximately 35,000 customers in the state were without power for more than a week, including me, for most of them, actually. So the Assembly Standing Committee on Corporations, Authorities, and Commissions, which I chair, held a hearing to examine the emergency storm response by utilities. And how we did this, really, we had hearings after Quinn and Riley as well, and Sandy as well. So we've implemented laws as a result. But let me I'm going to go backwards. So I'm going to go where we are now, because I know you wanted to talk about, you wanted me to mention about the bill we passed most recently. So I'm going to talk about that, and then I can go backwards to where we began and how we got here a little bit, maybe in question and answer. So there was a group that I live in Westchester County, which is a suburb outside of New York City, and a fellow legislator who didn't run for re-election had formed a group called United Westchester. And I took that over after this last storm and chaired it along with our county executive to really do a deep dive into what happened and how we could make changes, really from the very municipal level. So the group, which originally formed in 2018 following Riley and Quinn, had a combination of local, municipal, county, and state elected officials on it, which really all of us were completely involved in the storm repairs and response. So United Westchester investigated the utilities' response to Isaias and issued a report with recommendations for improvements. It became very apparent that utility companies must make substantial investments in storm hardening and resiliency to better prepare for future storms. And the concern was, were they doing that, and by what mechanism are they doing that? We interviewed all of the utilities in our catchment area, which were quite many, because many of those utilities have a statewide presence. So we interviewed them, and we learned that essentially the funding for resiliency, was part of the rate case. And the vicious cycle that creates is that the utility will propose a resiliency and storm hardening plan as part of the proceeding to increase their rate. And because of their poor performance in the storm, they are the outcry from the public is, don't give them any more money. They don't deserve it. They're not doing a good job. So it created a cycle by which we could not put the investment into storm hardening and resiliency that we thought we needed to do. And we, as a group, recommended that we look at ways that we could increase funding. And I will say that after Sandy, we had a lot of FEMA money, and there was a lot of money put into storm hardening, which has helped us a great deal. But we're talking about going forward. So we looked at a model that Florida had done to address resiliency, since they also face large-scale, lengthy power outages caused by hurricanes and tropical storms. And in 2019, that state had enacted two things. One, they enacted, they set in place the in law that utilities had to file a 10-year storm protection plan with the PSC. And they also did a separate customer charge to recover those costs. So we attempted to do something similar, modeling it, obviously we had to adapt it for New York, but that law, believe it or not, is being, I think, it might have just happened. It's today. It's a matter of whether it's an hour ago or an hour from now. But the PSC is actually approving the mechanism by which we do that. So it hasn't started yet. We don't know if it's going to work, but we're hoping that it'll change people's minds about what some of those costs are, so that we not only have a plan, because we've also required a 10-year plan, but we will have an ability to pay for that plan through this increase rate, or this different rate that will be established in New York. So that's the, so I can't give you how well we're doing, except that I can, if you want, talk a little bit about what we've done in the last 10 years, but I may leave that to see if anybody else is interested in that, and, and stop here.
Thank you so much. I actually was gonna ask you a question similar to that. So I'm glad you prompted it, Assemblywoman. It's really interesting and to see the way that states sort of learn from each other. You mentioned the Florida law. We actually had a presentation on this at a recent in-person meeting where one of the state's utilities was outlining that. So I actually, at this point, I think we can open it up to the Q&A, but if you could start by just describing some of the initiatives over the past decade that you have, that you think have been most effective in New York in terms of the public policy response to some of the storms that you mentioned, the outages, and just in terms of the public policies you think have been most effective in helping the state to avoid those types of disruptions and the severity of them.
Yes, of course. So, the most devastating storm was Sandy, and the flooding and chaos that it caused, the homelessness it caused, needed an immediate relook at what are we doing. So, you can, so one of the things that, utilities were always required to submit an emergency response plan, an ERP as we call it. But in the law, we actually improved and required annual updates, which must be approved by the Public Service Commission, so that it's not just some plan sitting on the shelf. It's actually a living, breathing document that is reevaluated on an annual basis. And we made it enforceable, more importantly. So for example, because we've had subsequent storms, the utility was measured by those things it put in the ERP. So, having looked at that myself, there would be, the ERP would say, okay, we're going to have this many crews, and we're going to have, we're going to be, going out and trying to get sort of municipal aid, but, not exactly municipal aid, utility aid from other places at a certain point. And if they didn't do that, if they, which they often were in violation of the emergency response plan for subsequent storms, they were penalized. And the penalties were also reevaluated because they were set in law, and it was recognized that we had very small utilities. In Westchester, for example, we have Central Hudson, a very small utility, but we also have Con Edison, which is a humongous utility. And by having those penalties put in place by an absolute dollar figure, it didn't mean anything to Con Edison. So a percentage of their earnings and their and their worth were actually put into the law. So penalties meant more, and so there was a big wanting to avoid them. So there was the carrot, there was the stick, and there was the plan. And So following Sandy, we had substations that were washed away with salt water, and it took a long time to restore those areas. So they raised them up to prevent them from being flooded in future storms. That was an incredibly important storm hardening activity for Long Island. And they also, in New York City, underground and insulated the undergrounding of many of the, it was underground, but it was flooded out because it needed to be shored up and hardened. So that was done. And we haven't really seen a tremendous problem in New York City as a result in subsequent storms in terms of outages, and or Long Island has been spared as well. Now we're just left with the Hudson Valley and the rest of upstate because of the trees and the fact that the wires are all low-hanging fruit. But we've seen utilities do, as was mentioned by the prior speaker, targeted undergrounding, but these are all expensive options. And again, learning from other states. I mean, we looked at Florida. We spoke to Florida about how they included communities in their undergrounding. So we're looking at that now. Just yesterday, I had a conversation with a couple of local. With Con Edison and the town that I live in, because they're interested in maybe pursuing something similar to what they did in a part of Florida. So it's a constant, but we came from a horrible place, and with hardening, FEMA money, and it's some changes in the law, we've made great progress.
Thank you for that. So now let's sort of officially switch into the final portion of today's webinar, the Q&A. If our other panelists could come back on camera and join us. A reminder to our participants, if you have a question, please do put it in the chat. We will reference those questions. But to touch on the undergrounding a little bit, Matt, you mentioned that in your presentation. I believe Virginia passed some legislation that helped with identifying and sort of prioritizing some of those strategic undergrounding initiatives. Could you discuss a little bit how that legislation has maybe helped the utility to prioritize those investments?
I can talk a little bit about that. We call that our strategic undergrounding program. And the key thing with the strategic undergrounding program, and as was mentioned previously, to underground lines, there's cost associated with that. So in terms of, it's not something that it's not called the universal undergrounding program for a reason. It's the strategic undergrounding program. So what we need to do is we need to identify those tech lines, that infrastructure where it makes the most sense based upon our previous experience with outages. And that's really what the strategic undergrounding program has been allowed to do, is to develop an analytics platform that we use, actually developed within Dominion Energy, a data analytics platform that we can then track the information associated with the performance of these most outage prone tap lines, and then also prioritize those based upon their technical need for being undergrounded. One of the things I'll mention as well about the strategic undergrounding program is the fact that we try to look at not only as I mentioned, the outage performance. We also want to look at that program through the lens of the demographics as well associated with each of the areas of the program, so that we're not targeting one demographic or preferring one demographic, whether that be percentage minority or whether that be based upon household income. So all of these things are pulled into the strategic undergrounding program. That's been allowed for us and provisioned for us in the within the grid transformation and strategic undergrounding rate cases that have gone through our state that have been approved by our state corporation commission. that answer your question or address your thoughts there, Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. One thing I'd like Amanda to maybe speak to is I know, Amanda, you're active in the National Association of State Energy Officials with your counterparts from across the country. We discussed how New York sort of referenced some of what was happening in Florida and learned from their colleagues there. I put the same to you in terms of your work with NASIO, what you've learned with some of your counterparts across the country and how they're managing these same issues, obviously different from state to state, but anything you've tried to bring back and implement in Kentucky?
So I just returned from the NASIO Southeast annual meeting as of yesterday, so fresh off the press. We all are experiencing a lot of the same issues. Right now, our high focus is the IIJA funding that is coming out that we're all excited about, but we also have a lot of questions. We cannot really inform some of our stakeholders at this time because we're waiting on some requirement clarities. Right now we're all a little sitting on the edge of our seat, figuring out what it is that we really can do best with this funding. Should we look at things regionally to go after a larger set of our energy grid based on the funding that we're actually going to get per state? It's not to sound unhumbled, but some of the dollars coming in, I believe it's about 5.6 for the states, is actually not a whole lot when it comes to using those dollars for energy resilient investments. And we understand that. But we're also learning along the way. So right now it is the time to be in energy. It is very much ever evolving. We are now at the forefront, like Matt's saying. It's not the same lens that we're looking at 10 years ago. We have a lot of different layers and levels to consider. And at least on the Southeast, well, no, I take that back. I was at a Midwest the week before tabletop. We're all in the same boat. Of course, we all have the same end goal. How do we become more resilient? Or prepare for resilience. So, of course, you got regions in Florida. They're doing more of the hurricane type stuff, hardening the grid with that. In our state, we focus a lot, Kentucky, on flooding and high winds and tornadoes. Tennessee's a lot in the same boat there. A lot of our programs are limited to the funding that we get is limited to kind of maybe our staffing right now. And we've noticed that throughout the Southeast. We understand there's a lot of resources available right now, and we want our hands in all the cookie jars, and we're just not sure how we're going to be capable of doing that. But our eyes are all on the prize right now. We're all about in the same boat. And it was very nice to see what other people are doing and the tools that are being created. And you just don't have to reinvent the wheel. You just have to start talking to one another.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful to hear. I know a lot of people are very interested in those funding sources. In addition to, I want to reiterate, with Assemblywoman Paulin mentioning the FEMA funding as well. Those funding sources are very important to this work. At this point, I sort of want to open up a question to everyone because all of you sort of mentioned this in your own way, but I'm interested in some of the ways that the various levels of government and industry are working to enhance collaboration and coordination across the sector. Assemblywoman Paulin mentioned the United Westchester and bringing the different stakeholders together there. Amanda, you sort of talked similarly about your FEMA funding going toward that type of work. So, are there specific initiatives that cut across state and federal government and industry really well? Are there areas that could be improved upon in your opinion to ensure, there's greater coordination and planning, both, before, during, and after disaster events?
I'd love to chime in if that's okay.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, the Department of Energy and National Association of State Energy Officials, NARUC, NGA. Everyone right now is very much supportive, and they're also trying to break language barriers or any type of clarity right now based on some federal funding that's coming down, IIJA, FEMA, BRIC funding. What we've learned is a lot of these state energy offices have not yet made connections with the EMA world, which so far that's been kind of the hindering. Coming from an emergency management background, I was then the bridge for Kentucky. That's the only reason we were kind of able to get in so quickly in the first round of 2020 is because I understand how to write the grant, to understand hazard mitigation. And so that's one thing that the DOE and NASIO are quickly trying to learn themselves so that they can become subject matter experts for all of the state energy offices. And kudos to them. They're doing a really great job right now trying to connect with all the states.
Thank you for that. Assemblywoman Paulin, how about, in terms of bringing those various stakeholders together, did you have any lessons learned about the importance of having those perspectives and making sure everyone was sort of aligned through a process like that?
Well, I think that we, what was felt after the first storm was, oops, sorry about that.
You're okay.
Trying to get rid of it. What was felt after the first storm was the lack of coordination between the individual municipality that has responsibility for road clearance, and the fact that Con Edison, for example, which is the utility that serves our area here, weren't responding to the municipal leaders in a prompt way. It would almost feel like they're calling these problems in and nobody was hearing them. So we organized, for the second, third, and fourth storm, they started to do what they call, they had municipal liaisons. And now you can just decide that you want a municipal liaison, during a storm or just a mild storm or a problem in your area, an outage, you can have that so that there's much more of a direct link between the utility and the municipality. It hasn't worked perfectly. Some of the other utilities have used technology to do that so that you can see, when you've called in your problem, whether it's on the board, and that seems to work. And we recommended, United Westchester recommended, that all utilities do that because it's very frustrating. So there's a constant, you have people on the ground, the public works people on the ground, and then the utility has to know to respond to them. We had a lot of mutual aid. The people saw the mutual aid sitting around the streets because there was so much, we needed so many, and yet there was no real coordination between the utility and mutual aid. And so it was frustrating for the municipality because they would see workers sitting around not knowing if they could direct them. So there's a constant need for more coordination. But I think after having so many storms in a row, we're actually addressing that. We're a very large state. So, we have, the very local mayors, we have the county executive, we have town supervisors, and everybody's all overlapping each other. And you just have to make sure that, that we're all speaking as efficiently and productively as we can. So we're getting there. But it's again, part of, the emergency response plan. How, that was part of acknowledging that problem. And it's actually in the physical document, how they're going to be reaching out. We had, the link between cable, people's internet and, how they power on and power off, so there was a lot of concern, did Con Edison or Central Hudson or NYSEG communicate with the internet provider? And that wasn't being done, so now, there's almost a realization that it's got to be across the board. the Public Service Commission has to really monitor that coordination between all those parties.
Thank you. That is a really great response, and I think something that everyone is learning and trying to enhance in the years to come. So unfortunately, that is all the time we have today. Once again, I want to thank our speakers for the time and effort put into this webinar. We really appreciate the expertise that each of you were able to bring to today's discussion. And of course, thank you to all of our attendees for participating. As a reminder, recordings of our webinars are available on NCSL's website, and this one will be available shortly. Thank you for your interest and participation, and for your continued support of NCSL and the work that we do. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.